You are in the assessments and grading practices workshop. And I want to start by making a bit of a disclaimer and tell you that this is a collection of suggested information or best practices that either I have experienced personally or learned in my own professional learning journey. And so I've done my best to try to link resources for you to be able to go back to, but because many of you have been fellow practitioners with me, some of this may be repeat information, but we're just going to go ahead and engage in it and see where it takes us. So thank you for joining me today in this conversation. I know based upon the conversation that we had this morning when we were going through the 6As, I was the facilitator for the assessments room, and it's a big topic and there's a lot of questions, and so hopefully some of those we'll be exploring in more depth, and your questions or ideas will be answered through this process. So I'd like to start by I was looking for the perfect quote. This gets kind of close. This is by Robert Marzano, who, if you're familiar with the critical concepts, that comes out of Marzano's work. And he said, characteristics of sound feedback include that it should be frequent, give students a clear picture of their progress and how they might improve, and provide encouragement. I think about feedback because I think so much of thinking about assessment is in that space of feedback and thinking about our students as growing in their learning, whether that's in our individual classes and content area or within the context of the project itself as well. For today, here are some of my hopes that we'll be exploring. One is reflecting on the idea of formative and summative assessment within our own contexts. And as I said, I've got some resources that I'm going to talk through and share with you. We'll be looking for ways to determine and communicate measurable outcomes for students so that there's that clarity and transparency for them. And also thinking about the role of assessment within project-based learning. I wanted to start with this assessment continuum. This is something that comes out of the ELD framework, and I know some of you are familiar with it, but I just love it as a visual of thinking about our progression and our role and ways that we can really push in and support students along the way of moving toward proficiency and moving toward this idea of large-scale summative demonstrations of learning. And so we're going to spend the majority of our time in this space of thinking about that formative within that context of regular opportunities for students to reflect and demonstrate for us. We'll think about the context of our own unit outcomes and thinking about that in a summative way and how that can contribute to their learning for within the projects. And then we'll also think about that large scale summative. In this context, we're thinking about it in relationship to the project deliverables and the project outcomes. So with that said, I wanted to just have some common language that we're sharing here. When I think about formative assessment, these are some of the things that come to mind. It's that space of monitoring and getting that regular feedback from our students so that we can make the necessary adjustments. And I think those adjustments, we need to be mindful that they're happening in instruction, in content, as well as delivery in how instruction is happening. And so sometimes it's not necessarily about the content, but maybe the way that we're designing what we're doing. And so sometimes it gives us that opportunity to make that shift. For those of you who know me, I'm a huge advocate of student reflection and teacher reflection, well, all around reflection, nonstop. But I think that is like, it's so powerful to give students space to reflect. And I think one of the biggest ahas that I had in my own teaching practice is when I discovered that I could slow down and provide opportunity for reflection. And what that did was it actually gave students an increased capacity for their learning because they were fellow journeyers with that awareness along the way. And so I've got some examples of opportunities to provide reflection that I'll be sharing with you. And then the other thing is that it's not always quantifiable. So when we think about formative assessment, it really is feedback for us. And so it's not necessarily when we ask students to engage in reflection, it could function as like participation credit, but it doesn't necessarily have to be graded. It really is in that space of providing feedback for us. And then in thinking about the definition of summative, I want us to be thinking about this in the context of our own teaching. So as a classroom teacher, I'm thinking about my end of unit assessments as being summative or somewhere in that space of summative. Thinking about them being aligned to standards, and so knowing exactly what I want to measure and having that clarity with rubric criteria and making that transparent for students. And then ultimately, when I'm thinking about a summative assessment, I want students to be able to not just regurgitate the content to me, but I'll be able to transfer those skills. So whatever their learning has been, be able to take it to a new context and apply that same learning to be able to demonstrate for me that proficiency around standards. So let's dig in just a little to formative assessments. And this is like a, I don't know, just a smattering of some ideas for ways to formatively assess. I will preface this by saying that structures and protocols are the way that I think we can provide students with those building blocks of being able to express their thinking. A lot of times when we say, like, you know, talk with a partner about what you think about this, sometimes they don't necessarily have the language or the structures to be able to say maybe what's in their minds. And so these are just a couple of examples. The first one comes from a book, and I have this linked on the last page, but it's called The Writing Revolution. And this is a book that I've been working with for about a year and a half now, and I love the structures that it provides and ideas for all content areas. So it has ideas for how to provide students the opportunity to express themselves at the sentence level. And the premise on this is that if we want students to eventually get to the place where they can write well-designed paragraphs and, you know, larger pieces of writing, the work that we can do with them at the sentence level is really going to facilitate that ability. And so I think the patience and the repetition of giving students that opportunity. So this example here is seemingly super simple, but I'm going to pause for a moment and have you just think about it and even write it down. You don't have to write down the whole sentence stem, but thinking about your experience this week, maybe think about the 6 A's this morning. And I'm going to have us take 2 minutes, and I want you to complete each of those sentence stems. So this experience of the 6 A's this morning broadened my thinking because, broadened my thinking but, and broadened my thinking so. So take 2 minutes, and we're thinking specifically about the 6 A's this morning with your because, but, and so.
Carissa, we were wondering whether or not we should write this in the chat or just
I think on a separate piece of paper.
Okay.
Yeah, because it really, this is for your own thinking. Thank you. So I'm not going to have us share out about this, but hopefully what you're noticing is that simply by thinking about that sentence with those 3 different words, it's sort of challenging you to have different perspectives or different ways of responding to that idea of broadening my thinking. And so I just wanted to share that as one example of a way that you can have students complete that. You could, if we're in the distance learning context, it could happen in the chat. It could happen in a discussion board forum. It could happen in a digital notebook where they're keeping track of their reflections, and something that you then can go through very quickly and look at what's happening with them in response to whatever their recent learning is. And so it can happen in the context of content or reflection on the learning experience. So that's my thought on that one. For the second bullet point, I only have a couple of protocols that are linked here. But what I do want to say about especially protocols for conversation is that the longer that I'm in education, the more I realize that they're so critical for us to provide students with those protocols, because they don't know naturally how to have conversations. And I think one of the biggest academic conversations, and I think one of the biggest areas of learning is how to be attentive listeners. And so we spend a lot of time, I think, thinking about ways that students can speak and present and share their learning. But I think that lost piece that is really imperative is the art of listening. And all 3 of these protocols challenge students to engage in active listening in order to participate. And so we did the Save the Last Word protocol on Monday with our launch when you were sharing out ideas about identity. I do have the instructions linked for you there. The paraphrase passport I like because that has the nuance or added layer of giving students opportunity to paraphrase what someone has said before adding their own information. And so I think that art of restating, we want them doing that in their writing. And so that opportunity, especially for students like our English learners, they need multiple opportunities to engage in that before they can feel confident in the writing aspect of it. I'll share the next slide in just a moment because there's one additional protocol that's on that. But the other element is the simplicity of just having an exit ticket. And this is something that I love to do with my students, just to get like, what's an aha that happened for you? Or like, what was new learning for you today? And then what's a question that you still have? And sometimes I'll have them do that on a Post-it note and then just hand that to me on the way out the door, or have chart paper where they can put those up. But that is immediate feedback for me, especially for, I mean, how many times do we say, does anybody have any questions? And of course, they're not going to ask any questions. Of course, they're not going to tell us, those questions that they still have most of the time. And so this really is that opportunity to continue to build in equity and make sure we're hearing all voices. And it takes me 2 minutes to read through that period's aha and a question. And then I can start the next day by saying, hey, look at, these are some of the questions that you still had at the end of the day yesterday, or whatever it was. And so it really is in that space of that ongoing adjustments that I can make in real time in order to support equity for all students and making sure that they're all supported. The other protocol that I have here for you is it is super structured. And at first glance, and maybe at first try, you might think this seems like a little much, but I have seen it in action and I love it because it's really what we want students to be doing as far as supporting their ideas with evidence. And so if you look at it, essentially you've got 3 students A, B, and C. And student A is making a statement or a claim about something. And then student B follows up with that and asks for student A to basically provide evidence by saying what makes you say so. And then student A is able to draw something directly from the text in order to support their claim that they made. And then it goes through the additional steps there. The other thing that I want to say about these academic conversation protocols is that it's going to take time for students to feel comfortable and to feel proficient in doing these. And so I would also offer that disclaimer that if you try it the first time and it's messy and uncomfortable and it feels like a disaster, don't throw it out. Keep trying, because that's part of that, the training wheel process is trying something new and growing to feel comfortable with it. So within that space of formative learning or formative assessment, those are a couple of protocols that that I feel are very powerful. So what I'd like for you to do now, I'm going to pause and think about formative assessment and what I went through, the ideas that I went through on that slide. And I'd like for you to think about one way that you can expand formative assessment in your face-to-face or digital classroom. So if there was an idea that was sparked based upon what you saw there, and then I'm going to invite you to put that into the chat, and we'll take about 2 minutes or 1.5 minutes for you to do that. So Dana, I like that trigger about digital notebooks. I have a really cool link for that Chris Thompson shared with me at the beginning of distance learning, and I'll add it in for all of you in just a little while as soon as I can get that. But I'm hearing things like using the academic conversation protocols in breakout rooms. Awesome. Using Google Forms for exit tickets. Love that. All right. Thank you for sharing and reflecting. So we're going to move into thinking about summative assessments for a few minutes. And again, this is very broad. And so one of the biggest pieces to the summative assessments, and I'm thinking about specifically your individual content area classrooms. And so whether it's science or English or history or even the CCTE classes, at the launch of a unit, that essential question that you are asking students to consider should function as kind of the overarching piece that takes students through anything that they read, anything that they experience, and ultimately lead them to what they're answering at the end of the unit. And so an example that I have, a little bit later is a unit that I did for a number of years, and it was all about considering how soldiers returning from war had experienced trauma. And so that was my essential question that students were exploring as we read multiple texts, as we did some research, and then ultimately their writing task was to identify the similarities and differences between the way the writers of fiction had conveyed that trauma and how their research confirmed or denied what those writers of fiction had done. So anything that I had students doing along the way was leading to that task that they were going to do and answer at the end. So that's an example of that. So in thinking about end of unit assessments, I just gave a couple of suggestions here, having some kind of a writing task that answers the essential question. And keep in mind, it doesn't have to be an essay. So if we switch the language and say, write a proposal or write an article, making it more real world, especially if you have a writing task, a real world writing task that's connected to your project outcomes, the opportunities to practice with that. You want to deliver something to the school board. So essay, can feel like ancient and dusty and boring and sad, but we're really asking them to write an essay, but giving it the spin of a different type of task could like brighten it and perhaps make it more interesting. As far as the speaking and listening, what I included for you are two links. The fishbowl structure is a link to a Vimeo Socratic seminar that I ran across several years ago, and it absolutely inspired me and gave me opportunity to rework how I was conducting Socratic seminars in my classroom. I think it's a 10th grade classroom, and students are synthesizing their learning from multiple texts, and it's a really fabulous model to watch and think about how you might do that in your own context. And then I also created a scoring guide, and the reason for that, I use that with my students. And the reason that I created it is because I got so tired of students asking how many times they had to talk. And so I really wanted to bring clarity around what the purpose of the Socratic seminar was and what I was looking for in what they had to say, that it didn't really have anything to do with how many times. It had to do with the level of the sophistication of what they had to say and reflect on, and also their ability to actively listen to their classmates and make connections. So I included both of those as examples for you to use in thinking about how you might have students participate in in a Socratic seminar that's responding to the essential question. And little tip, I know that there are a number of us who, at the end of a semester, when we're crunched for grading, the Socratic seminar is a fabulous final. It's doing the same thing that we're asking them to do with writing tasks, but the grading is basically on the spot. And so if you're thinking about being buried under grades, having a Socratic seminar as a final for the end of a semester can be helpful. And then the third thing that I included here are 3 components from a performance task that I wrote a number of years ago, but I really liked what Cydia had to say yesterday about providing students with opportunity for choice. And what you see in this example are those opportunities for choice. But the key thing, I think, with choice that we want to remember is that our rubric criteria is very clear for students. So it's not just a free-for-all. They have parameters that they have to stay within as they make those choices. And so this happens to be a literature example. But at the end of the slide deck, I also included a link to the performance assessment resource bank where this actual performance task is housed, and there's tons of others in there of all grade levels and all content areas. And so it's a really great resource, and you can sign up for a free account. So that would be something I would encourage you to consider as well. Now moving on to thinking about our project deliverables, and these are just some things to keep in mind. I think one of the hardest things in developing projects is where and how is it going to, where are students going to be held accountable? Where is it going to be measured, in what classes? And so this is just a little bit of my thinking around that. The first point there is to think about using production documents to chart and account for progress along the way. And I'm going to show you some production documents in a couple minutes. But what I love about using a production document is that it can live in between multiple classes. And so students can be working on it in my class, in my Google Classroom, and then let's say they go to their history class or their media class, they can open up that same document out of Google Classroom or out of their Drive and continue working on it under the jurisdiction of that teacher. And so there's this transparency that happens, and it's powerful for students to be able to see that this project, this work is living in multiple spaces. And I mean, we've seen countless examples in the course of this week and a half where that can happen in the collaboration within documents. And so I do encourage you to figure out systems, and then it's quantifiable, right? So if I'm let's say I'm asking students to complete 3 rows of a production document in preparation for their deliverable, then I can give them a progress grade because I've made it quantifiable that those 3 are due by this time or date. And so it's helpful in that way. Also thinking about which of the classes will be responsible for particular deliverables. And so and then that third bullet point I think is really powerful for students to see. Maybe in English I'm working on a component of the project, but my other project teachers are going to get that grade included as well, because, and I'm going to talk about this in a little while, there's a portion of my grade book that is devoted to the project. And so that's another way that students can see the value of doing good work, because it has influence across their project classes. The fourth bullet point, I think, is something that we often wrestle with project-based learning, especially when students are working in teams, of having one student or particular students who are doing more work than others. And so in this context, my encouragement is figure out ways to hold students responsible for their individual thinking first before they come together and share those ideas. And so then they can receive a grade on the individual thinking. And then once they come together to collaborate, and then we provide, protocols and structures for them to share that learning together, then that can be an additional place where they're rewarded for that collaboration. But I think that pause, or that first step of the individual responsibility, is powerful for making sure that all parties are coming prepared to the collaboration. And then just one final comment on this. When we think about exhibiting, that really is the point where we're celebrating. So the grade is really about what they've produced along the way, and then getting to that place of completion. But when we participate in the exhibition, maybe the grade is in a place of participation, but I think just thinking about where in the individual classes and the project classes things are taking place, that helps us to be able to then just step into the exhibition and celebrate. So with that said, I want to take just a couple of minutes and think about essential questions. And this is where I was talking about thinking about summative assessments as end of unit, and then summative assessments as our project deliverables. And so I just have 2 examples for you here. An example for content for that unit that I was referring to: what is the impact of trauma on soldiers returning from war? And as we read and navigated texts, students knew that they were answering that question. So in their notebooks, they were collecting evidence along the way, so that when they got to the point where they were doing the writing task, they had everything that they needed in order to be able to put their writing and their ideas together. And then as they started into that writing task, I made sure that we walked through the rubric, and I'm going to show you this rubric as an example. This is just one of my all-time favorite rubrics, and I think the main reason is because it breaks it down into 4 categories, and it is in first person, and so the students are thinking about their own writing as they're looking through the criteria. Are you able to see the rubric? Okay, so I'm not going to spend much time on this, but a couple of things I just want to point out to you. One is that you can see that all content areas can be represented through using this. The common position paper to me just basically translates to synthesis. And so I'm giving students opportunity to work with multiple texts and then synthesize their ideas together. The first category is under idea development. And so this is where their main thesis or main claim is conveyed. The second category is the supporting evidence. And what I like about this is that if I'm asking them to write a paragraph, then sufficient evidence may mean 2 pieces of evidence. If I'm asking them to write a paper, maybe sufficient evidence in that context is 2 pieces of evidence per paragraph. And so using the nuances of that and kind of that open-endedness is helpful in helping students to understand and use this basically as a checklist. And then the other 2 parts, one is about organization. And so what I would always tell my students is that if we think about organization, we're thinking about the structure of your paragraph. And so all of these components are speaking to structure. Logically ordered, what are the topic sentences doing? What am I doing with structure and transitions? How am I concluding my writing? And so all of that is housed here in this category of organization. And then lastly, the category of conventions and style, thinking about using academic language, control of standard English. So as you can see, and again, I'm just suggesting this as a great example of a rubric that really breaks down for students to be able to see, because again, that transparency is so important for them to see what it is that I am measuring in looking at in this case, in their writing. And then the example, this comes from the exemplar, but the question, the overarching question, essential question for the project was, how can a student's passion for a social issue and their relationship with a volunteer be translated into an informed opportunity to become more civically engaged? And the piece that I wanted to share with you there is that every project deliverable that students were engaging with in individual classes and together was answering that question. And so as we think about assessments, I'm watching for how what they're producing is answering that essential question that I've been leading with the whole time. All right, so I want to take just a moment and go a little bit further into thinking about rubrics, because I know that that's a huge piece in our thinking. And this is in connection to what Lance was talking about yesterday. From this book, Rigorous PBL by Design. This is linked to a document that's actually an excerpt from one of the pages. And I love what it breaks down for us in thinking about the surface, deep, and transfer criteria that we're looking for. So when we start to go into how might I score that? How might I use a rubric to measure that surface, deep, and transfer knowledge? This is just some general language in thinking about that with descriptors that I think are really powerful. So that's linked there for you on this page. That's a link. But then on the next page in the book, and I apologize for photographs. This is the only way that I can build it and make it make sense for you. So this is page 1 of the rubric. This is an example from English, but I love the way that it's broken down with the specific language of what does it look like in this assignment that I've given for students to demonstrate that transfer of knowledge. So there's language that's laid out for the transfer level, the deep level, and then the surface level and the support level. For those of you who are familiar and have been working with the critical concepts, you'll see a very similar relationship between what we see happening at the level 2 with the critical concepts, and then the 3 and the 4 taking us to deep and transfer level knowledge. So there's a really nice correlation there. So I would invite you, again, in just going back to this idea, as you're thinking about an assignment or you're thinking about a unit and building out a rubric or using some language to help students determine where they are in it, I feel like this is a really great place to start by using those couple of resources. And then this book itself is also linked at the end of the slide deck, if you are interested in asking your administrator to buy that book for you. All right, I just have a few more things to share with you. In this one, so I'm thinking about this question: how can student skills for project outcomes align with my individual course standards? And so I have a couple of suggestions here, and I know that many of you who are in this workshop are already doing these kinds of things, but if we can find 1 or 2 or 3 common texts that the students can take from one class into another class, I think that's another really powerful layer of transparency for them to see the continuity between the classes. And so I gave an example here of like a text or an article that students are reading in English, and then they take that exact article. So they've read and annotated it in English, and then they take that article, and maybe it's in the compendium, which I'm going to be talking about at 2 o'clock. So maybe that article is in the compendium, they've read and annotated it in English, and then they take it into their history class, and because of the relationship for what both classes are doing at the same time, they read it in the history class and look at the historical context, or so you're meeting standards that you're trying to get them working with in the history class. And so same thing with science and English, or science and history. And so I really do encourage you, and I just put 2 resources, but there are countless resources, Common Lit or Newsela. If you can share, something that shares a similar topic or a similar theme, that's definitely something that is, again, powerful learning for students to be developing skills around a single text together. I've referred to planning documents, and so I want to just open this one for a minute to show you. And we at Kearney, this is something that came about years ago for the purpose of having these places for us to see what students were doing along the way. So in this case, this example happens to be one of the deliverables. Students were creating a zine, which is basically like a mini magazine. And so within that mini magazine, we always had this at the top because we wanted students to always be thinking about who their client is, what the organization is, what are they working on. In this case, the subject was the actual person that they were telling a story about, who their audience is, what the goal is, and then their name. So this is what I was talking about for that individual accountability. And so in scrolling down here, I've got the directions that students needed to follow in order to work their way through this production document. And then I also provided them with an example. And the part that really I want to draw your attention to is this part right here. So in the top part, the segment is telling me basically, in this case, which page they're working on. The narrative script is the actual text that or the content that they would have on that page. And the visual is the image that's going to connect with that. But this was always my favorite part. The rationale, because this is where students are doing the analysis and essentially arguing for their ideas. And so the rationale is the explanation for why they chose this picture to go with this language. And to me, this is like a mini like bit of evidence and commentary, because they've got their evidence here and their commentary. And so when we think about how in my English class, I was constantly working with students to develop a claim, support that with evidence, and then to be able to elaborate on that evidence. And so here, this is in this production document, that's an example of how I'm getting students, I'm moving them toward that by having to provide that rationale as they go. The other thing, though, about this production document is that they could take this and they weren't allowed to start working on the media portion of it until this document was completed. And so again, it's another one of those markers along the way that we as a whole team could hold them accountable. So in their media class, the media teacher could say, hey, you've only completed two pages of your zine in your production document. So you can't even start into like the fun of the creative part until you've completed all of your thinking around this. So I'm a huge advocate, and there's nothing magical or mysterious about a planning document. It's really just figuring out what you want students to do, and feel free to make a copy of that one and then modify it to fit your circumstances. And also feel free to reach out to any of us to be thought partners with you in that. So that's that. And then I just wanted to talk about grading for a minute. And again, this is ultimately how I was able to make sense of, to get as close as I could to equitable grading practices, because grading can be sometimes a nightmare. So I broke it down into these larger categories. A lot of the time, students are reading and writing. And so if they were engaging in assignments that fit into that category, that's where that grade would go. Again, for the speaking and listening, this also includes participation in those reflections or in those speaking protocols or in their exit tickets. And so anything that had to do with participation, informally or formally, fit into that category of speaking and listening. But also the main reason that I wanted to talk about this is that across our grade levels, there is a project component for the grade. And so that would range anywhere from 10 to 20% of their grade, because so much of what we were doing was in that project category. But that also meant that if I was working collaboratively with another teacher, that grade would go into both of our grade books to reward students for the work that they had done collaborating between the two classes. And then finally, the assessment category for any of the larger summative assessments that students were completing in class. So I really just wanted to offer that out, because in thinking about PBL, sometimes we wonder, where in my grade book does the project fit? Where can it be represented? And so I just wanted to mention that. Okay, so now we're going to try something different. The idea of the Jamboard is fairly new to me, and so maybe you are experienced with it. But what I'd like to do as we start to wrap up this session is I'd like to invite you to the Jamboard. So the Jamboard, I don't really know like how long it's been around, so I can't speak to it, but it's kind of a cool place to like visually brainstorm or collect ideas. And so once you get in here, I've got the 3 questions that I have linked in the slides, and there's a little sticky note feature here where you type in your answer. You can change your color, and then once you've said something, you can save it and just drop it onto the Jamboard. And so what I'm going to invite you to do right now is let's watch our Jamboard fill up with, I'm going to ask that you try to respond to all 3 questions. So one is, what do I agree with from this workshop? And this is another reflection strategy. Something I agree with, something I already do, and something I aspire to do based upon this. So just real quick, I want to show you in your Google Drive, this is how easy it is to find the Jamboard. So go to New, More, and there it is.